following Marcus is kind of this wonderful double-edged sword. I mean, you set me up so wonderfully for things I'd like to talk about, as did David and Drake. There's all sorts of great connections here, and I don't know how this sort of spontaneously emerged out of the long email thread that I didn't participate in except read.
For us, your presentation is the mystery part of it.
Oh my goodness.
So, you are the unknown. So
I know. Well, I like to fly under the radar because then no one steals my ideas. Okay, but of course following Marcus is always a little bit terrifying because you're so very lucid. My little presentation is called Moving Beyond Materialism, Consciousness and the Science of the Subjective. And I have to give credit right now that these ideas that are opinions of mine and a lot of the things that have gone into this brief 20 minutes was inspired by a teacher that I had as a religious studies student named Alan Wallace, who is a Tibetan, a white guy from the East Coast, a Tibetan Buddhist who ran off to Tibet and spent some large portion of his life actually practicing, and is someone who hosts the Dalai Lama in the U.S. and is very interested in the study of consciousness. So he's a teacher and a scholar. He's also very involved in Western academics. And so if there are things that are interesting to you in this 20 minutes, then I would direct you toward his several books and many writings. He's really quite a profound.
Have you mentioned his name?
Yes, Alan Wallace. B. Alan Wallace.
It'll be on the website.
Okay,
yes,
so
as will the entire presentation.
Okay. So if I start to go super long, somebody has to yell at me. But
I will.
you didn't yell at Marcus.
No.
No, but she's next up. She's getting answers.
Okay. So right. So the prompt for this out of the box session was sort of mysterious and long and circled around and was very, very chaotic in a way. There was a long discussion. We talked about what is real, or you guys talked about what is real, and I silently read the emails. Science versus mysticism was one of the things. Objective versus the subjective were considered. Finding common definitions and overarching themes were really elusive and really challenging. And I think we all agreed that playing scientists versus mystics is a terrible idea. It's just like the most boring thing we could possibly do. And so I think dualism is a problem. I think that may be the problem, is that we tend to divide these things, right, into a subjective realm and an objective realm. And it's very ingrained into our sort of modern secular paradigm and the scientific, well, I wouldn't say the scientific method, but the sort of scientific materialism that sort of walks around pretending to be the scientific method, and more on that later. And it turns out this dominant paradigm, it runs into a lot of problems, or at least some problems, and it has trouble with some very real phenomenon. So Marcus mentioned some scientific problems I'll get back to, but consciousness is kind of the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room. So in this 17 minutes or so that I have left, I kind of have 4 goals. One is that I want to help everybody in this room to unambiguously define consciousness. I have this cool picture of a guy pulling a white rabbit out of a hat. So this is going to be the magic trick. So we're all going to define consciousness, and it's a real thing and a natural phenomenon. At least that's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to suggest that by philosophical construction, the mainstream Western science, which I'll differentiate from the scientific method, is really fundamentally unable to illuminate the subjective realm, which is where consciousness lives. I'd like to clarify what science is and what it isn't. And then I'll offer an example of how we can adjust our science such that it better addresses these things. Okay, so step 1, consciousness. And so this is an exercise for everybody in the room. And either you're going to be very skeptical, or maybe I'm going to say something that's totally obvious. But consciousness has some symptoms, so I can read the side effect label. Symptoms may include emotion, perception, and will. Experiential and temporal continuity, right? So we walk around in the world and we have some sense that the kid who fell off his bicycle at 9 years old is related to the person I am now, right? There's this kind of trajectory of existence, this kind of continuity that feels very real. And then we have individual intent. identity and there's an interiority to our experience of living. And somehow we walk around, in the way that Drake pointed out, that we have somehow this life that we wander through, kind of the secular, everyday, watch TV, go to work, be in traffic life. We live in this place where the subjective realm is sort of delegated to this little corner of being not particularly real somehow, at least in our mindset. I totally trailed off and forgot where I was going with that thought. Anyway, the point of this whole thing is that I think all of these things are subjective experiences, and my sort of operative definition of consciousness that I'm totally comfortable with, and I think is you can't argue with too much, is that consciousness is that you experience. It's pure subjectivity. It's something that you don't need any instruments to measure. You could argue with somebody from the 13th century that, are you having this experience? Is the rock having this experience? Maybe not. But there's a more subtle point here, and it's that sometimes it's argued that consciousness and subjective experience is some kind of illusion. That somehow in the neural chemicals and the electrical interconnections of things, we're going to somehow figure out that that's some sort of trick that turns these thinking computer-like machines between our ears into thinking that they're having experiences. And I would argue that by our definition, that consciousness is experiencing. Any sort of illusion of consciousness is identical to true consciousness. It's that no matter how you frame it, the fact that you have interiority to your existence is a real thing. And I feel totally safe in making that statement, but people are welcome to argue at the end. So presuming that you experience also, and of course, the only place you can know for sure consciousness exists is inside yourself. So the fact that you're still listening may mean that you're conscious. But that's why this is an argument that you need to agree on for yourself. So it only exists in one place. It's a bona fide natural phenomenon or material or property. I don't quite know what to call it. But it's like uranium or a tornado or temperature. I think it's a natural thing. But of course it offers no external objective reference, right? It's totally defined in terms of this subjective thing. So there's no objective trace, which is why it's problematic from the point of view of the scientific materialist. And so I have this quote from the Dalai Lama. So although it's difficult to pinpoint the physical base or location of awareness, it is something that the individual alone can feel and experience. Each of us cherishes it highly, yet it is private. And so it's really hard to know how to put that into a framework of scientific understanding where it's so important, and I think agreeably important, that we're able to compare things with each other, and there's repeatability and all these things that the scientific method requires. It's just more challenging than most objective things. Okay, so good. We made it through the first part. The second part is that won't scientists eventually get it, question mark? So there's a sort of conventional belief in the Western scientific establishment, and I think it's really the common understanding, is that nature is made of objective stuff. And so I don't know if this sort of how this interacts with Marcus's three balls. But
He's got it.
well,
He's outed. Oh, that was terrible. He's outed now.
no, I have three balls coming up too.
Promise. Never tell anyone.
That wasn't a criticism. Okay, right. So the conventional belief, I think, in mainstream Western science is that nature is made of objective things. It's made of things that you can go out and set on scales. I have a little picture of scales. Or you can attach your voltmeter to, and you can get your co-researcher to walk up and attach his voltmeter to, and you can agree on some physical properties about it. You can compare it to some known reference, and you have a very well established idea of what this property is. So I will argue that this is a belief system. This is not somehow an inherent characteristic of the scientific method. It's incredibly convenient in science, right? Because you can compare things directly. However, other phenomenon that aren't objective phenomenon, so mainly the subjective, and consciousness in particular, are either considered not to be real or considered not to be scientific, which is sort of a nice way of saying not real. Although Marcus made a good point that the question of what real is sort of ambiguous, and so I won't belabor that point. But you know, if this is what science means, then you know, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, physics has no ground on which to explain a purely subjective phenomenon. You can find physical objective things that are strongly correlated with the presence of that. So, you know, if I go under anesthesia to have an operation, I know my consciousness went away. I stopped experiencing for some period, and hopefully I wake up with my leg fixed from my bike accident. But that doesn't equate the things, right? The definition, the thing that consciousness is really this subjective dimension. And for that, you can never directly compare something. You can never weigh it against something else, except in a sort of symbolic sense through language. Okay, and so one more sort of funny thing. So on scientific materialism, which is this belief system that I think gets sort of unfairly grafted onto the scientific method, you know, it doesn't matter so much to me what's real and what's not. I'm an empiricist. I care a lot about what I observe. You know, I sit in my chair on my balcony and I see things happen, right? So there's observed phenomenon. It makes science easier to do if you can divide those phenomenon into objective phenomenon and subjective phenomenon. And this is the great duality of Western science, is that we break things into two parts. And I think this is where we get into a whole lot of trouble when we try to find common ground for things that we want to talk about today. Now, I think the dominant paradigm does this really funny thing now, and here, I'll kind of show you what my diagram looks like. So, I don't know how well you guys can see this, but this is where we start with observed phenomenon, and then you get this objective and subjective, and then in this dominant paradigm we do something sort of funny. We define objective phenomenon to be real phenomenon, and then we expect to be able to figure out how subjective phenomenon can be built out of those things, when in effect we've just defined away the reality of the subjective. And so this just seems like a totally weird thing to me. So scientific materialism, this belief system, is kind of a monism. It dismisses the subjective as a not real thing sometimes, or at least I think that's sort of the common understanding. But it's based on this weird asymmetric duality that allows you to separate your subject from your object and do kind of scientific method. Also, we know that there's trouble in modern physics, so Marcus already laid these things out. Quantum mechanics fundamentally entangles the observer. Complex systems produce order that are totally reductionism defying. So those are both things that would be wonderful to talk about at some later date, but not in 20 minutes. Right. And so then I have this quote from William James here, and I have a little picture of William James, because he's sort of wonderful and incredibly insightful philosopher and psychologist from the late 1800s. No subjective state, whilst present, is its own object. Its object is always something else. And, you know, William James was thinking about subjective research. He was thinking about studying the interiority by looking inside and treating that in a scientific way. And he was running into problems with this duality of subject and object. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so here come my three balls. I have this slide that says, this is science, a methodology. Okay, and so I'm just going to give you the completely stupid version of the scientific method here. Right, so, and I'm either right-handed or left-handed, but I'm confused now. So it works like this. Model, observe, predict. Okay, so this is like just a super simple version of the scientific method, and there's lots of other versions. And it shares a lot in common with Marcus's three balls. This is our most fantastically successful knowledge gathering and synthesis system. Like, this is an incredible success of humankind to have built this pinwheel that allows us to refine our knowledge about how nature works, so that now we all have iPhones in our pockets, right? I mean, the understanding of science and our ability to produce technology is I think there's amazing value in it, and we've been very successful at it. Doing science like this has a few prerequisites. So you need repeatability of your observations. You need specificity of prediction and the conditions under which experiments are conducted. So if I can't tell you this is exactly what my theory predicts, or this is exactly the conditions of my lab when I measure this weird quantum phenomenon, then my measurement or my theory is not really valuable. Objectivity often gets used, and I think this is actually a source of confusion as a third requirement, that somehow the observer needs to be separated from the thing being observed to be a robust scientific measurement. I think there's some confusion here because I think a better way to phrase this is universality. And we run into universality at work in terms of trying to find a theory of the proton. This is what Marcus and I do. We look for theories of protons and neutrons where you can reduce the structure of them to some common set of things that can be reused in different experimental contexts. But I think there's something really important here. So the way in which objectivity is typically used, separating the measurer from the thing being measured, the important aspect of that is really that the thing that I measure is a common aspect of nature, something that when you go and look in your experiment, you're measuring that same common thing. We want to separate out, in terms of science, the part where my being gets wrapped up in the thing I'm trying to measure, and then I can't communicate it in a useful way, or it becomes not useful to someone else. So what we really want is something universal. It's easy to do it if you require objective separation. But this aspect, but I think science is getting harder. And I think the problems we need to solve require us to do more challenging things. And I think we need to find ways to not require objectivity in the sense of separating out the self. But we still need to retain that character of universality, which allows us to compare our observations with others. Okay, and so this slide, I don't know where I am in time. I have like 37 minutes now?
I care.
Okay, good. Okay, this slide is called Building the Bridge, Subjectivity and the Scientific Method. Okay, so this is where I'm going to try to connect things up, and we'll see if you guys hang with me on this. So with this materialist assumption, distinguished from the scientific method, so I think one thing is kind of dubious and unnecessary, and I think the scientific method is a really great thing that works really well. I'd like to suggest that we pursue the nature of consciousness scientifically. And then I wrote, blast, our usual instruments are useless for this task. So, right, I can't take my probes or my telescope and see consciousness because, as far as I know, it's only inside me. It's not even in you guys. You have to, it's up to you how you feel about that. So the new technology I want to suggest here, I'm going to call scientific introspection. And so this is where meditation, mysticism, ritual, prayer, a whole litany of things that we associate with the subjective can sort of climb into the picture. Now, of course, good science requires rigor. It requires training, it requires all of those things I talked about before, right? The specific language, you need to be able to characterize precisely. I think I'm going to say this all on the next slide, so I'm just going to not worry about it. But just like there's bad science, I think there's also probably crappy mysticism, right? That it's not actually useful. It's a bunch of things that somebody told you to do that doesn't give you anything, and there's no value to it, right? I think it takes training and focus and a meaningful tradition where you've built on concrete foundations gradually to form something that's actually useful and actually of scientific value. And in this sense, I mean scientific more broadly in a sort of non-dual way. Okay, so probably a lot of us have thought about this, but Eastern knowledge traditions have practiced things like this, what I'm calling introspective research for millennia, right? There's elements of this in religion, there's elements of this in all sorts of mystical practices throughout the world. They may not have the science aspects of it, or they may have some of the science aspects, but humanity has the knowledge to bring these things together. So, right. Okay, so I have a slide called How to Collect Robust Scientific Knowledge Through Introspection. And I just bring up those same three things before. In order to satisfy scientific requirements of repeatability, specificity, and universality. You need highly trained practitioners, and in the subjective realm, it means they have to have honed meditative skills. So that's like focus and clarity, and not being a practitioner, I can't say what all the details are, but those are ideas. You need a precise language with which to guide introspective experiment, and you need to be able to characterize experience in a very precise way. And I think something that Western science can bring to this sort of subjective research is that we have incredible experimental design, right? We know how to build double-blind experiments where the practitioners are shielded from the goal of the study, and the people who interview them are abstracted from the conditions on which a particular practitioner was having their experience. You can build knowledge, and we have tools like that that allow you to extract much of the bias that an individual might have. This is where you get universality. Anyway, right. Okay, so just a couple of quotes from Buddhism. So my example when I have this argument with people usually is Tibetan Buddhism. This is a long tradition, 2,000 years of people studying the interiority rather than necessarily the exteriority. Whether it's subjective or non-dual, I'm not sure I'm ready to argue too much now. It's a sort of a subtle distinction in this case, and probably requires more knowledge than I have. So I'm going to quote Alan Wallace, who I brought up at the beginning, as a practitioner for a couple of things here. So there's this practice of samatha, which is essentially, he says, samatha is a serene attentional state in which hindrances of excitation and laxity have been thoroughly calmed. It may be understood as a contemplative technology. So this is a honed contemplative tool that you can use to retrieve meaningful information from, it's maybe useful to other people and useful for a broader scientific exploration from introspective study. He also writes, due to the homogeneity of this mental continuum, the experiential effect is that of consciousness apprehending itself, right? And so if you juxtapose that with that William James quote, where he was very much trying to view consciousness from this dual place, where he was running into the problem that you can never, the thing that you're observing is always somehow trailing behind the thing that the consciousness is. Wallace's contention is that at a certain point of clarity, and he, in the more extended quote, points out that in this Buddhist tradition, consciousness is divided up into these very tiny time slices that for most of us, I'm running out of time.
3 minutes.
Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay, this is going to be perfect. I think I can land this thing. Right. So Wallace describes.
You can have 4.
Okay. So Wallace describes, consciousness to the untrained introspective as this train of many time slices, milliseconds long, of which most of the time we're a passive observer, and we only get a few of those time slices where we can actually sort of consciously reason about what we're observing. And that through this practice of really honing mental focus and clarity, one can achieve this really high density of these lucid reasoning moments in the thought train of consciousness. And, not being a practitioner myself, I can only speculate, but it sounds to me like there's a point at which this sort of duality, the duality disappears. When you end up in this sort of non-dual state of really being able to observe and retrieve meaningful information. So there's this, also I have some quotes on precise language in this Buddhist tradition. So I'm going to screw up this name, Padmasambhava. If there are Buddhists out here, you can slap me and explain more because I am not the expert. But he's this legendary guru who informs a lot of the Buddhist traditions. The real, if there was a real person who this is, they lived sometime around 750 of the Common Era. But he teaches in his writings of detailed procedures by which pupils can learn to achieve just a huge variety of mental states. And he describes the procedures for getting to those very precisely. And he says basically, so here's the quote. After following the following steps, there will arise a sense that they have become inseparably equalized. It is impossible that some such kind of experience will fail to occur. And I think what he means here is that through this training and by following these very carefully laid out procedures by which one can attain these well-defined mental states, the initiates can be trained to be objective in a sense in their contemplative study, to remove their personal bias, and they can get to the same place in the subjective landscape. And that gives them this universal position from which to report back on what they found. And then you can, your theoretical introspective scientist can do what they will with it. Okay, so here's my parting thoughts. You argued that the subjective stuff is real stuff. I reminded you that science is different from materialism. That materialism defines away subjectivity a priori, and it really has no ground on which to tell you anything about consciousness. Science can indeed include the subjective.
Josh,
Yeah.
do you need to change the tape? Because I want to get this.
Yeah, I need to in a second.
This is his point, so don't let the tape run out.
Is it okay?
I'm going to do the parting thoughts again from the top.
Good.
You argued that the subjective stuff is real stuff. I reminded you that science is different from materialism. That materialism defines away subjectivity a priori, and so it doesn't really have any ground on which to say anything about consciousness. And it blinds us to a very real phenomenon, and maybe the most profound and important experience of what it means to be. Science can indeed include the subjective, and look to the Tibetan Buddhists for an example. Non-duality seems to emerge naturally in their tradition, and that may help us to overcome some of our difficulties. So get ready for scientific introspection, and I wanted to somewhere write critical mysticism. I thought that was critical mysticism is mine. So go do robust science with your introspection, and that's all I've got. So thanks. Young woman in the striped shirt.
Okay. So, can you give your definition of, I'm sorry, I have laryngitis right now.
It's written yesterday.
Can you give us your definition of consciousness again?
Yeah, I mean, consciousness is that you experience.
Is
It is the experience of experiencing things.
Okay, well, I guess further define experience. No, it's just like, okay, you experience, so this involves your perception, your emotion,
Sure.
how you integrate information. So these are all things that I think a big thing that's missing from this whole theory is the neurological sciences that exist right now.
Mm-hmm.
That, given my field, I have to read a lot of this, and I have to incorporate this a lot into my therapies that I do.
Yeah.
That there are things that have been discovered in the human brain that correlate very
Absolutely.
strongly with
Absolutely.
these actions. So like the
Absolutely.
limbic system goes with the emotions, the thalamus
Yeah, yeah.
goes with how we perceive everything, how it goes and how it integrates together and how it gets delivered to our cortex.
Sure.
And these are things that MRIs and fMRIs, and these are things that
Absolutely.
are very real, that give us, so I mean, from a physicist's point of view,
Yeah.
the tools that you have are not adequate for defining consciousness, or not
The
defining,
tools I have are not adequate for that stuff.
showing consciousness.
Well, I think the missing factor is action. Experience is one thing, the second part is act.
Well, I think she's talking about a physiological basis for
Well,
consciousness,
no,
which I
but
believe.
my point is consciousness, there's the missing half of consciousness, which is action. Experiencing one thing is everything. You can sit and experience. You can put a sensor, or a voltmeter is experiencing. It's experiencing an electric charge. It's measuring it.
Well, I see.
Where's the
I'm
action?
not sure I buy. I'm not sure I even believe.
What do you
that.
mean by action?
Action, thought. I am. I did. What's driving the action, as opposed to just the experience? I could sit and I can experience everything. I don't do anything. How am I alive? How am I being conscious? It's the action. It's the forethought. It's the desire that's missing from the equation.
The word desire
Okay.
is important.
So in more kind of direct response to you, I would say that the thing
I
that
wasn't
you would.
actually done, but okay.
Huh?
I wasn't actually done, but okay.
Well, okay. Can I respond to your first part, and then
Yeah.
you can give me the second part? So I would say that the aspect that's missing, and I agree that there is amazing technology, but no matter what technology in the traditional sense you have, you would never predict an interiority. You would never predict from traditional science as practiced that this thing, whether it's a human or a voltmeter or a stone, is having an experience, is having a subjective experience. You might suspect that because you're working on a person when you're doing these measurements, but we would never know. There's no ground on which to predict that anything, human or otherwise, is actually experiencing.
So experience just being like aware of your experience, or aware of the fact that you're
Awareness,
feeling
sure.
these things?
Sure. I mean, you could
Okay.
imagine the Josh robot that was built in a lab that was made of all sorts of electronic parts. Do you expect, and in all ways behaved like me, but it was made in the lab out of little parts. I don't know if I expect that Josh robot to be conscious or not, right? I don't know if that Josh robot is just acting like me outwardly. I can't tell from the outside with my science whether the Josh robot is experiencing or not.
No, there's two different things. There are two sets of experiences that are going on. There's the objective experience of what the physical body is doing that's observable, or what's being done to the physical body. Then there's the subjective reality, is how the mind and the body are interpreting things and what neurotransmitters are firing. It's a matter of, can you measure it? What can you measure right now?
I mean, I don't know what to equate with subjectivity. I don't know of anywhere else in the universe, but in my own experience where this.
No, I
subjective.
appreciate that, but there are two sets of experiences going on.
Sure.
You can duplicate the objective experience of to the body,
Yeah.
and it'll be the same for everybody. But what's happening inside? How are you interpreting it? There are so many different factors to that come from life experiences, how you're interpreting the meanings that have been attached. They're not going to be the same.
From the point of view of building a science of mind, a holistic science of mind, I think, and I'm not probably the best person to argue this, but, I think if you look at, very disciplined practitioners of these subjective traditions, throughout the world, I think that they go through exactly the kind of practice and discipline to try to calm the individual aspects, right?
Right, I appreciate that, because I mean...
Julian,
What?
hang on. We have two other things that have to go on, and then we gotta go to dinner.
Okay, well, I
Okay.
think food's more important than discussion.
Now, okay,
Dinner.
okay, yeah, I'm hungry. All right. First, I wanna hear the rest of what she said, because she got kind of waylaid. And then I wanna hear you, and then it's my turn.
No, I got a comment after that, but it's fine.
Oh, all right.
My point is that in combination with what you're kind of hypothesizing to be a solution, I guess is what you're suggesting, or a tool to use to objectify consciousness, is that we do have tools that exist. And another one, other than like the MRIs and fMRIs, is that through things like traumas to the brain, you have patients that have brain injuries and strokes, and these are things that neurologists and psychologists and speech pathologists use to do research on treatment. And through parts of the brain that are injured, this manifests itself in behavior and how they describe their experiences.
Yeah.
And these are things that are observable. These behaviors and reactions are observable. And awareness of, I think it's called I'm totally blanking on the term, but a big thing that happens in a lot of brain injury patients and right hemisphere disorders is that you lose awareness. You lose awareness of yourself, or you lose awareness of your memories, or you lose awareness of your own disorder, of what's happening. And I think that these things are being, put in random control trials, and you're able to measure. And so I think that a good solution would be to add another thing into your model, I'm sorry, I'm reading the word model, that's not what I meant.
Methodology.
Is to kind of combine these with tools that we do have.
I certainly agree. I mean, I brought up the example of anesthesia, right? I mean, this is a profound case where you do something external to the human body and the experience disappears, right, until that wears off.
But
It's
like,
certainly all interconnected.
okay, I can be done. Go on. Go on, Lily.
Bruce?
Well, sort of building on that, the problem in anesthesia is knowing whether people are really under. And just in the last year or two, they have had a lot of success with using certain electrical techniques to really be able to predict if you are aware or not. So it seems like there really are physical correlates that you can use.
There are certainly correlations, but to be able to, in the strict kind of scientific materialist sense of, being able to equate a thing with a thing because I've measured a physical property of a thing with a device, you can't ever do that.
But that's all science ever does, is make correlations.
Well,
That's
the
all it ever does.
Oh, but I mean, if I want to study a tornado, I can measure its wind speed. I can put a stone on a scale, right?
Well, to a certain extent, you don't know until you know, right? You're postulating. Ultimately, you're postulating there is something more ineffably to consciousness than the neurons firing itself. Is it just a correlation, or is there something more going on there? Right now, we can't say for certain, or at least no one's willing to go certain. Of course, biological research is saying yes, and they're moving forward. I mean, how are we measuring everything? I mean, there are those that would measure, say, the very example of the Tibetan monks you're measuring. They say they have entirely coherent brain activity and very high brainwave activity, very coherent. That because they have done exactly what you said, mastery.
Sure.
So there's a lot of aspects along that line.
I think we need to be very careful here. I mean, I think we should learn from the story which happened with the exploring the DNA. If we now know exactly how the DNA of the human body looks like, and we don't understand anything more about that. So I think that this is a comment I would like to make here. Even so, there are technologies around that, and you can see something. This does not tell us anything about how this really works. And there are other principles to that. I mean, if you look to the body, for instance, and to its DNA, then there are a lot of things which are corrupt and are broken. And somehow our body knows which cells to use and which cells to throw away. And these are the principles, I think, which we need to find. And this is, I think, coming from physics. This is where we typically aim for, really finding the deep things instead of just looking to some person sees red, and this is now going on. This is now how his brain current looks like,
But neurologists don't actually think that.
So
Like in terms of MRI, it's showing something that your brain has blood flowing to that area during this kind of activity, but they don't actually think that that's. I mean, they kind of caution that it's.
There's no difference between some of the ways physicists go in and measure some things rather indirectly. I mean, especially at a quantum or particle level.
No, but I'm just saying that I think the real theory lies a little bit deeper than just looking to those things. Or can you give a definition what consciousness is? A better one than Josh.
No, I think awareness is totally part of it. What it actually is.
Self-awareness.
Well, that's how I'm going to close.
Okay, David.
Your comment to me during my talk, you mentioned transcendent numbers, and I love that. It's something I was debating whether I wanted to put into my talk. But I love the term transcendent numbers, the way you had that lined up. So I'm going to segue, because this is the way my Asperger mind works, to the movie Transcendence. And there's a lot of popular books and movies now on the topic that Josh is addressing today. And so I'm going to, this is a joke, but I'm going to ask you, can you prove that you're self-aware? I mean, if you've seen the movie, you don't get the joke.
No.
But that's the big, they have created artificial intelligence, this thing called PIN, P-I-N.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
And so this guy comes in, ask PIN, can you prove yourself? And PIN asks back, can you prove you're self-aware? And there's our conundrum right there.
Isn't that Blade Runner?
No, this is Transcendence with.
We just saw it last week, so don't.
Blade Runner's a great movie.
I was just throwing a curveball.
So yeah,
Okay,
it's a neat thing to.